Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My name is Catriona Mumuli. I'm the Policy, Advocacy, and Communications Associate at IAVI. It is my pleasure to open this timely webinar on turning challenges into opportunity partnership, where we look at partnership models for sustained HIV vaccine research in Africa, which has been organized by IAS, that is the International AIDS Society, and IAVI. This session marks the second in a four-part advocacy series, New Horizons for HIV Vaccine R&D. So the series aims to mobilize global and regional stakeholders to help secure sustainable, diversified investments, along with stronger political commitment for African-led HIV vaccine research and development. So in the first webinar of the series, which was on Africa leadership in HIV vaccine R&D in an era of shifting global priorities, speakers and panelists examined Africa-led assets, persistent gaps, and emerging opportunities amid global funding cuts. It was launched in an opening where the discussions focused on sustaining African leadership in R&D, in HIV vaccine research in the face of funding uncertainty and shifting geopolitical priorities. So participants emphasized the urgent need for diversified investment, stronger political commitment, and African-led approaches to secure long-term progress. There was a highlight of major financial pressures, including delayed PEPFAR reauthorization, tightening national institutes of health budgets, and even shifting the current shifting donor priorities. We had Dr. Nigel Garrett, who described the impact of abrupt funding cuts in South Africa, which led to the termination of Brilliant Consortium, job losses, and program disruptions. While some initiatives were sustained locally, broader Pan-African research efforts were significantly affected. Despite these setbacks, advances in long-acting PrEP and promising HIV vaccine strategies, including broadly neutralizing antibodies and germline targeting designs, continue to offer scientific momentum and hope. So from Kenya, we had Marianne, who is from the Kavi Institute of Clinical Research. She explained how the US funding freeze in 2025 disrupted trials, antiretroviral supply chains, and even community trust. So in response, Kavi strengthened partnerships with local stakeholders, deepened community engagement, and even integrated HIV research within their broader infectious disease and health system initiatives. So the Institute is also leveraging artificial intelligence and local immunology expertise while prioritizing youth and women's engagement and advancing scientific citizenship to co-create solutions with communities. We had Dr. Tariro, who is from the Africa Clinical Research Network, framed the current moment as both a crisis and an opportunity. Since we have had decades of investment in laboratories, skilled scientists, regulatory systems, and community engagement platforms that provide a strong foundation for a Pan-African, Africa-led research ecosystem. So by harmonizing regulatory frameworks, leveraging digital tools, and strengthening innovation hubs, Africa can expand its share of global clinical trials while reducing reliance on external donors and drive locally responsive innovation. The panelists that we had during that webinar underscored what is at stake if momentum stalls. So if the momentum stalls, there will be loss of infrastructure, which exists, workforce talents, research innovation, policy influence, equitable access pathways, and critically, we'll lose community trust. So at the same time, they identified clear, direct opportunities for domestic resource mobilization, establishment of a continental research fund, stronger parliamentary engagements, private sector partnerships, and Africa-led innovation in clinical trials. So the overarching message was one of cautious optimism. Despite funding disruptions, Africa possesses the capacity to expertise and expertise, and even partnerships required to lead HIV vaccine research, strengthening public trust, and build a sustainable, self-reliant research ecosystem aimed at ending HIV as a public health threat. As the four-part series continues, the focus will shift towards actionable advocacy strategies, innovative financing models, regulatory reform, and coalition building. So the goal is clear: to ensure that HIV vaccine research remains a global priority and that Africa leads not from the margins, but from the center of scientific agenda. So I would like now to welcome you all, participants, and even the speakers, including our panelists and moderators, to this webinar, which aims to unpack how successful HIV vaccine partnerships are built, governed, and sustained. It also aims to examine funding and investment dynamics, highlight key champions, and enabling factors. And we're also going to explore how advocacy can mobilize political will and resources by identifying best practices, gaps, and actionable strategies. Today's meeting is comprised of two 20-minute presentations, followed by a 35-panel discussion and interactive Q&A sessions. So we encourage you to use the Q&A function on Zoom during the presentation and panel discussions to submit any questions you have for the presenters. Please note that this meeting is recorded, and by participating, you are consenting to be recorded and for the recording to be used publicly for educational purposes. I would now like to introduce my co-chair, Maureen Luba, who is AVAC's Senior Advisor for Global Policy. In this role, she helps lead the organization's policy advocacy efforts and initiatives, extending from Africa to the global stage. Maureen is a public health practitioner and early career researcher with over 14 years experience in the region and implementation of sexual reproductive health, HIV, and health system strengthening programs in East and Southern Africa. Over to you, Maureen. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Catriona, for the kind introduction. So without wasting much time, allow me to introduce our first presenter, Shetal Kasum, who is a Senior Research Officer with the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation, as well as the Senior Lead for the Growth Study Site. Shetal will kick off this webinar with a case study on the Brilliance Consortium. Over to you, Shetal.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for having me. Thank you for sharing the slides, Ashley. Sorry, my computer had a bit of a challenge today. So my name, thank you for the opportunity, and I really wanted to thank IAVI and IAS for this excellent opportunity to have this discussion. My name is Shetal Kasum. I am a Senior Research Officer and a Principal Investigator at the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation. And I'm here representing the brilliant principal investigators and the brilliant consortium. And I'd like to share how a period of crisis became a catalyst for resilience. So we're going to use Brilliant as a case study for this. Next slide, please. So let's start at the beginning. The Brilliant program was initially envisioned to be a discovery medicine program. And as you can see, it was launched in 2024, actually. And as you can see, majority women scientists and all African scientists at the fore. Next slide, please. The consortium is led predominantly by African women scientists and comprised of a multidisciplinary team ranging from lab expertise, R&D, manufacturers, and community representation. And overall, the Brilliant objective was to evaluate HIV vaccine candidates emanating from our continent. The idea was to be a first in Africa clinical development.
Voice, we can't hear you.
Hi, can you hear me now?
I
Is this
can hear
better?
you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So the idea was to be a first in Africa clinical development hub and aid the HIV vaccine discovery medicine program. The idea also was to rapidly evaluate African immunogens by doing discovery and preclinical evaluation using mRNA technology that is evolving on our continent. So as you can see from this map, the consortium had representation from all over Africa. And these activities were actually supported under the HIV Vista grant from the US, which stands for HIV Vaccine Innovation Science and Tech Acceleration in Africa. And the aim was to be implemented exclusively in sub-Saharan Africa, where the highest burden of HIV exists. And the project funding was going to be directly to Africa. And this included lab capacity, manufacturing and R&D, and tech transfer in terms of mRNA. And through these efforts, African institutes would be encouraged to become autonomous and generate domestic resource support and create sustainable efforts and sustainable systems for HIV vaccine R&D. And again, I think the advocacy and community always touch on this, but in light of widespread vaccine hesitancy and misinformation, there's a clear advantage for having African scientists at the fore of vaccine development that will be used in Africa, because this enhances trust in our communities. Next slide, please. So the scientific strategy for the Brilliant Consortium was to use immunogens previously tested in humans, but first in Africa to advance the science fast and while building capacity in Africa. And then integrating our own African immunogens into the clinical development pipeline after preclinical evaluation. Next slide, please. So let's go on the journey from Brilliant 001, which was the first trial that was planned for the Brilliant Consortium, to Brilliant 011, which is where we are now. The Brilliant 001, as you can see, was a complex, multiple immunogens, multiple doses, and multiple prime boost combinations. It was a complex trial design, and it was aimed to be tested all over Africa at multiple clinical trial sites. The two immunogens that are to be tested is BG505 and 426 mod core, which have really excellent capability and potential to induce broadly neutralizing antibodies. The next slide. So a year ago, we were ready to start Brilliant 001, and then suddenly the funding cuts happened, causing massive turmoil, infrastructure collapse, and real individual pain. I think everyone in that photo went through the 5 stages of grief shortly after that. The Brilliant Consortium wasn't the only trial halted, as you all may know, and there were multiple trials that were halted by the USAID funding suspension. So after the crisis, the vaccine developers were luckily willing to step up and donate immunogens and together with philanthropic funding, this is where it brings us to our next slide. So, like I said, with philanthropic funding from the Gates Foundation and with national funding from the SAMRC, the Brilliant 001 study was still able to go forward. Noting that the complex trial design from the previous slide to now a very simplified, very lean, very focused trial design, and only occurring in Cape Town in South Africa, in one part of the continent. So essentially, it was sort of like the Hunger Games after the funding crisis. If you think about surviving and survival concepts, essentially what the consortium aimed to do, or what the investigators aimed to do, was to preserve their vital organs. So in this case, it was to preserve the B-cell analytic work that is being conducted at Prof. Penny Moore's lab in Joburg, and to use an existing site which already had the capacity and the capability to conduct a trial like this with the limited funding available. So essentially, it became lean and it became focused, and it came into a single site study, but still doing the important work and still doing the important research in these two immunogens so that we could further the field and further the program. The next slide, please. So even though we had initially planned to start with Brilliant 001, amidst the funding cuts and the 1 year that it took us to get here, there were a lot of changes that needed to happen because of product issues and because of adjuvant issues and so on. And really navigating all of those was a challenge for the study team. But eventually we came to this point where we're starting the Brilliant 011 study. And this actually is even more different from the Brilliant 001 study design that we planned to start at the end of last year. So the study schema is still very simplified. It's two immunogens still, but with a different adjuvant. And actually now looking at a germline targeting immunogen cocktail approach. And then again, with philanthropic funding from the Gates Foundation and with the SAMRC, we are also planning to start the Brilliant 002 study using an mRNA platform. And like you can see there, this is a complex study, and we're managing and hoping to keep this sort of study design for this platform. Next slide. So I wanted to highlight some lessons that were learned after the funding crisis. So it's important that we have innovative and efficient trial design, and African leadership and South-to-South collaboration is very important. And integration of research and implementation, community engagement and equity, expanding the prevention toolbox at a time where funding is halted and where we may not be as fast as we need with certain vaccine trials, and also where the capacity has been completely limited by the withdrawal of funding. There needs to be some regulatory innovation and harnessing digital health and AI, and also keeping in mind post-trial access and affordability. And the next slide. And then I think you might have seen the slide from Prof. Nigel's talk last year, but I just wanted to highlight that there are emerging networks and partnerships even after the funding crisis and after using a huge global partner. Africa can still stand on its own, and Africa is still quite resilient. So among the African Clinical Research Network, the GLISTEN network is also something that is to look out for. Next slide, please. So essentially, Brilliant is a case study in resilience, African leadership, and co-created science. Collaboration becomes essential under pressure, and competition alone cannot sustain science. So when the funding crisis hit, it became an incredible competition. Everybody was vying for the same source of funding to pick up the research and the programs that were dropped suddenly because of the funding. And with competition, obviously, you enter a survival mode. And once you settle down, you realize that actually collaboration is actually the way to go. African-led design, governance, and immunogen development are really the future of vaccine R&D. And the next generation of partnerships must be crisis resilient, equitable, and adaptive. And this is why we're having this webinar. And I've put a picture there of us crossing the finishing line. Actually, it was a long race to get to the start of Brilliant 011. So that's where we are now. Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge the PIs and the leaders of the Brilliant Consortium, our funders and collaborators, and we would not be here without the IAS and IAVI.
Thank you so much, Shital, for that very informative presentation. And I liked your closing part where you said partnerships need to be crisis resilient, equitable, and adaptable. Thank you so much. I would like now to introduce our second presenter, Nike Ndembi from IVI, that is the International Vaccine Institute, which is in the Africa Regional Office. Nike is the Deputy Director General, Regional Director of the International Vaccine Institute, overseeing IVI's operational, scientific, and partnership activities in the Africa region. He is also an associate professor in the Institute of Human Virology, University of Maryland School of Medicine, as well as a research professor at the Kanazawa University School of Medicine, Department of Viral Infection and International Public Health, where he completed his doctorate in molecular virology prior to joining IVI in 2025. Nike was the principal advisor to the Africa CDC's Director General, where he established the Partnerships for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing, creating a framework for regional vaccine manufacturing and self-reliance. Welcome, Nike. Over to you.
I hope you can hear me. I'm in the field, not good internet connectivity. I probably decided to just off my camera for now. Thanks so much again for IAVI and IS for this great opportunity to present at this important forum. I strongly believe this is the kind of engagement, advocacy that is required in times of crisis. Being sure that we really do some crowdsourcing to get the best information on how we can navigate. I think this is really commend the team for that. So I think the topic speaks for at least it serves turning challenge into opportunity, and this is back ages where Churchill said, "Never let a crisis go to waste." I think this is important. How do we build sustainable to be able to move the agenda on local manufacturing? So I'm going to get an example. I think we really want to be sure we don't get into the same scenario that a brilliant concept from brilliant consortium get really halted. I think it's not a way we should see the continent moving. I'm going to tell you why we really need to rethink the way we're doing. I think going really far from the political commitment to really scientific leadership. And that's why they pretty much like the previous presentation as well there. So I'm going to get the single example there. We're trying to see how we change this. And this is also was affected by the USAID funding because it was a request for $100 million project that IVI was working on with partners on HIV vaccine. I think now we had converted it into something else to diversify a little bit the antigens. But again, this is a call that good ideas usually get funded if we push and pursue our visions and mission. So ACHIEVE stands for Accelerating Health, Innovation, Equity, and Development of Vaccines and Biologics in Africa, which include obviously HIV vaccines. I think it's clear from the previous speaker. I think there's no need to reemphasize on that. But the point is that we really want to start thinking differently. But the summary of what I wanted to say, in addition, is that let's move from a unipolar to a multipolar, from global north to global. No single country should determine the trajectory of global health. I think we've learned already that hard way. We need collaboration, cooperation, sustainability from different partners. Already even on this call, different ideas, bringing different partners on the table. I think around the table. I think even Africa, we have not invited. We need to bring our chair to the table and then listen to the conversation, contribute to that conversation, even financially. So I think there's a need for political leadership, scientific leadership, ownership of the science as well, IP, data, samples, and the research, because ultimately those participants or clinical trial participants involved in those studies are definitely on the continent. We have the really that moral obligation to support the science for public good. So this is actually a very powerful slide speaking really on the reality of engaging our political leaders, scientific leaders, in really embarking into an African-led research, continentally connected, and then globally relevant. We don't want also to do science that only focuses on Africa, but it has to be globally relevant and to be continentally connected. How South Africa can connect to the rest of Africa to get the good science done. It doesn't have to be funded externally. It has also to come with resources mobilized domestically on this continent to get multi-centric study to contribute to the good science and advance really public health. So if you look at this bubble chart, on the y-axis, you have prevalence. On the x-axis, mortality. And you look at the bubble, the size of the bubble, I think gives you the burden by dialysis for the 30 really top priority infectious diseases. It's quite obvious here. Malaria, TB, HIV. At least for malaria and TB, we have vaccines, but we're looking for more really next generation of vaccines for TB. You all know the M72 studies and the 2 malaria vaccines. Well, they are still there, but there's a lot to do for optimization of those vaccines. But HIV is the orphan there. No vaccines. And then you can see those bubble, the gray one, these are the diseases among the 30 where there are no vaccines available. And the biggest one is HIV. We need to do something. We really have to do continue the science, the good science that has been going on this continent relating to HIV and other diseases. So I think the African Union set some ambitious target of manufacturing 60% of the vaccines by 2040. I think if you look at it in terms of disease prioritization in the box 2, when they have been bucketed, they're expanding. HIV sit there. HPV, malaria, pneumococcal, COVID-19 those days, because this was developed in 2021. I think this is a call really to be sure that some of those priority diseases we invest into. It's not the agenda of the global north. We really have that, again, moral obligation to support researchers for the diseases affecting primarily some of these, really our population. So this is going to come up with several innovations, both traditional and then innovative, disruptive technology, like the mRNA technology that was used at least for COVID-19 vaccine in a very short and reliable time. The reason why mRNA, because it's disease agnostics, and then you can get some of those diseases with those gray bubbles being tackled. I think this is important. So what we're proposing, I think, it's the conceptual framework, at least 2 vaccines. Hopefully, during the consultations, it gets to be HIV, it could be any other diseases, but we really want to be sure that it's a continental process that get to the selection of the antigens that go through this consortium. So 2 vaccines and one biologics, monoclonal antibodies, could be any others because we use the mRNA technology, could be sickle cell anemia. That's the beauty of the mRNA technology, being sure there are 2 new IPs, 2 preclinicals across the continent. This is a continent of 1.5 billion people, and then 55 countries, less than 5 animal facilities across the continent. I think we need to invest into research, development, science, and innovation to drive this agenda for manufacturing of HIV vaccines and other vaccines that are important. So I think moving from epigenetics up to vaccine purchase or manufacture, so including Gavi and Africa CDC pool procurement, this is an ecosystem approach, being sure that we really address some of the key components from really preclinical discovery, regulation, and then manufacturing. So I want to end there to say there's hope. There's hope because during the engagement for this 5-year project, $100 million, we have engaged with significant. I personally engaged with governments, ministers of health, head of state. I think we've seen a really mindset shift, and that's important. I think that's where we see that the political leadership and will is coming really through, and then that definitely going to help us move this agenda on manufacturing, HIV vaccines, and others coming through. This engagement has led 6 commitments from member states, each of them contributing $1 million per year for 5 years. Who would have believed this 5 years ago? I think there's already a movement, but we understand that we need to really contribute to this agenda, this ecosystem. We got $50 million from the University of Pennsylvania to support the consortium, $20 million for some of the philanthropists, and we're still engaging with the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, European Union, to be sure we mobilize enough resources beyond the 5 years as part of the sustainability. There's a lot to do on this continent, connecting the dot, the best institution like the Desmond Tutu and so on, pairing them with less mature clinical trials at some parts of the continent to be able to drive this agenda. It has to be beyond just South Africa. It has to be spread uniformly across the 5 AU region. So this is really the moment. We've launched Africa, Achieve Africa on the 15th of February, and that's the head of state of Zambia championing this. You can see at that level already, and there's 5 head of state that will really make commitment to support this initiative. I think we can get it done for HIV/AIDS. I'm still very optimistic that everything can be done to support the agenda. I think thanks so much for the invitation, and let's continue this advocacy and ensuring that we push the needle forward to get these vaccines out of the shelf. Thank you so much, and back to you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Nike, for that powerful presentation and for really unpacking Achieve for us, a milestone that I believe all of us are celebrating. I know the targets are ambitious, but I'm with you. I'm also very optimistic. I believe that it is all achievable. That is, if you all work together, if each and every stakeholder that is involved in this, amazing initiative plays their role. And also, thanks a lot for reminding us about the importance of political leadership, scientific leadership, but also data ownership. I think this is a conversation that I think a lot of us in our countries are having, around, access to data. How do we ensure that? I think in the work of the stop work orders, how do we ensure that, as countries, as government, we still have ownership, of the data that, we are collecting in our facilities, in the clinical trials, whether be it program data. So thanks a lot for that. So we've heard from Sheta, who presented on the case study of the Brilliance consultant, but also we've also just heard from Nike, who presented on Achieve. So we'll now move to the panel discussion. Just to kind of dive deeper into the Africa-led, Africa-centered partnerships, I think, which is what we are discussing today. And the aim of this panel discussion is just to highlight some of the strategies that we can to reinforce local leadership, promote equitable collaboration, but also to sustain at least long-term investment in HIV vaccine R&D. I believe these advocacy cities. We are trying to to bring back the momentum or to continue the momentum around ensuring that regardless of I know we have a lot of products that are coming in the pipeline. We have lenacapavir, there's a lot in the pipeline, but we still need an HIV vaccine, and I think that's we are all here, and that's what we are pushing, and that's why we still need to continue seeing continued investment in HIV vaccine R&D. So allow me now to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Amelia Mfiki, who is a community liaison officer at the Groot Clinical Trials Unit. And our second panelist is Honorable Fortune Daniel Molokili, who is a member of parliament and the human rights lawyer since July as a member of parliament in Zimbabwe, where he also serves as a secretary for parliament, Zimbabwe Caucus on Disability Affairs. But he also co-chairs, is a co-chairperson of the Pan-African Parliamentary Task Force on Domestic Resource Mobilization. Again, a very important topic for health, and the chairperson for the Parliament of Zimbabwe Caucus on TB. And last but not least is Michelle, who is the Executive Director for Glance Innovation and Product Development at the South Africa Medical Research Council. So thank you so much, to our panelists for joining us today, and to our participants. Please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we direct them to the relevant panelists. So yeah, I guess I will kick off the discussion with, and I'll start with you, Daniel. So reflecting on your role as a co-chair of the Regional Parliamentary Task Force on Domestic Resource Mobilization for Health, how realistic is it for African governments to increase domestic investment in long-term HIV vaccine research? And where do you see opportunities for regional coordination, such as shared financing maybe mechanism or peer accountability to support this effort? Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Maureen. Greetings, everyone. I'm happy to be part of this panel discussion on behalf of legislators across Africa. I'm a human rights lawyer who specializes in public health advocacy and a former Pan-African civil society leader. And I'm participating this afternoon as a member of the Portfolio Committee for Health in Zimbabwe and chairperson of the Parliament of Zimbabwe Caucus on TB, and also former acting chairperson and former substantive chairperson of the Portfolio Committee for Health in Zimbabwe. I'm also the co-chair of the Pan-African Parliamentary Task Force on Domestic Resource Mobilization for Health. So I'm happy to be part of this discussion. And I also wanted to say that as Africans, we must not forget that as we meet this afternoon, it is actually 25 years since our heads of states and governments committed themselves to increase domestic financing for health. In 2001, there was a big conference in Abuja, in Nigeria, where we have what we call the Abuja Declaration. And the Abuja Declaration is the most important policy commitment from the African political leadership with regards to domestic financing for health. For the last 25 years, most of the African countries have failed to allocate at least 15% of their national budgets towards healthcare, which is the commitment from Abuja. In Zimbabwe, my country is one of those countries that have consistently failed to meet that minimum 15% threshold. So as we meet this afternoon, as parliamentarians who are trying to create a Africa-wide continental networks, where we encourage each other and peer review each other and support each other to ensure that we increase our national government's ability to honor their commitments towards domestic financing for health. And that is a network that we want to encourage every other stakeholder in this meeting to reach out to us. We are present all across Africa in most of the African countries as a network. And our secretariat is in Nairobi, and we're working with the Waki Health. So I want to encourage us to work with us. And if you've got ways of advocacy or ideas to help or capacity build parliamentarians, we are available. But as parliamentarians, we are going to network together and make sure that we put pressure on our national governments to honor their commitments. So that is a key platform that I want to encourage you to be part of. And we are going to step up our efforts as we commemorate 25 years since the signing of the Abuja Declaration. We are also aware that our governments have committed themselves, for example, the government of Zimbabwe, to research and development. We are supposed to commit at least 1% of our national budget towards research and development. And in our country, like Zimbabwe, where I come from, we are seeing a government that continually says it is committed, but when it comes to the national budget, consistently allocating less than the minimum 1%. So that is another key advocacy area, which feeds directly to the situation where we're in, where we have a challenge where our reliance as African researchers has been mostly on the global north funding. But as President Donald Trump took over leadership in America, that source of consistent support has come to an end. So we take advantage of the fact that even though it is a challenge, it is also an opportunity for us to promote domestic financing for research. And since our governments have committed themselves to allocate at least 1% of their national budgets towards research and development, that's one area where we're inviting all the stakeholders who are here, especially academics and researchers. Work with us as parliamentarians. Let's come up with ways to promote and also emphasize the need for our governments to honor their commitments. A lot of money is available from these commitments. All we need to do is to ensure that when the budget is announced, that amount of money is allocated. There is need for advocacy, there is need for lobbying, and we as parliamentarians, we are here and we are available. We have built national platforms. We have got caucuses across Africa, so you can engage us through our parliamentary caucuses. We also have country-level coordinators that we are setting up, and we are also affiliated to other networks. For example, I have another role that I'm a member of the Global Board for Unite Parliamentary Network for Global Health, and I represent all parliamentarians in the Global Board in Eastern and Southern Africa. So we have other networks that we have set up, including the Global Caucus on TB that I'm part of as the National Chair of Zimbabwe, which you as academics, researchers, and other partners in this meeting, you can work with us. We also have champions that we are training, which you can also participate. If you reach out to us, you can help us to train champions who are parliamentarians at a national level and an international level who are available to speak and promote research and promote vaccine research and make sure that Africa controls its own research regime and its research processes. And we stop the reliance on the donors or the international or the global north. So I wanted to say in brief, because I noticed I've spoken for too long, I wanted to say that yes, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. So as African parliamentarians, we are seeing the silver lining on the dark cloud of funding, and we want to promote vaccine research in Africa funded by African resources. Thank you so much, Maureen.
Thank you so much. It's great to have you on the call, and thanks for your continued advocacy and for being the champion that you are, but also for being the voice of the civil society. I think in the parliamentary action that you are involved in. So I'd like now to hand over to Catriona to take us to the next set of questions.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And I loved your point on where you have called us to action, especially the advocates who have been focusing on the global north, that it is now time to focus on our governments. I loved that. So I hope you've all had every advocate who is in the meeting, in the webinar, please. I hope you've heard what Daniel has said. I move on to Shital. So what are the trade-offs between speed, equity, and national ownership in multi-country vaccine collaboration, and how should partnerships navigate them?
Thank you for the question. An excellent question. And I believe that the answer is not so simple, but I believe that the brilliant case study has sort of answered this question. So in terms of the trade-offs, I would firstly like to address speed versus equity. So when we are looking at these multinational or multi-country trials, these are often slower due to regulatory hurdles, including manufacturing, import permits, and so on. And these regulatory hurdles are often country-specific. But there is great value in equity, especially in terms of capacity building and representation for the trial and the product that's being tested. So it's very important to build regulatory capacity in parallel. And this touches on accelerating speed without forfeiting equity and ownership, and without forfeiting scientific rigor as well. I did mention adaptive trial designs. So adopting adaptive trial designs also allow us for momentum even under funding pressure. And it is very important for consultation to be had with regulatory authorities and as well as communities in the beginning, and important to harmonize the process of reviews. The reality, though, is also that a leaner and faster trial is actually quite cheap. It's much cheaper than a multinational, very complicated study. So with speed, we also, like I said, have to balance scientific rigor, and it's important to maintain the rigor as well as transparency throughout the program. So if you look at the Brilliant program, all of these concepts were envisioned in the beginning, and navigating these concepts were what we're going to learn through the consortium program. Now that we are just one clinical trial site, or now that the Brilliant studies are kind of happening independently, it's very important to maintain transparency and to maintain transparency to the original stakeholders and to the original scientists that were part of the the consortium, because that also facilitates ownership of this program. In terms of equity and ownership too, it's so important to leverage our African-based talent. Like, for example, in the Brilliant Consortium, for data for these studies, we use a completely African-developed and owned information system, which is called Bioinformatico. And this assists in building capacity further and actually building the economies. And it's something that's actually transferable and applicable to other African countries. Driving innovation also by ensuring adequate lab capacity and development so that we don't have to send samples out, which actually slows down analysis, is more expensive, and it hinders the ability to do real-time analysis. This can be mitigated by adequate lab capacity within the continent. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on IP ownership, because obviously with a consortium like this, you have to balance all of these things: speed, equity, ownership. And in a consortium like this, where the immunogens were actually developed outside of Africa, the developer, everything pre-study is actually owned by the developer, and everything post-study will then be shared by the consortium partners and PIs. And it's important, like, the concept of ownership is important, but I think we all need to focus on what is important, is that the whole point of having an African-led initiative and something based in Africa is so that we as a continent can help our people. And in the end, it may not really be about ownership. It's just that we are all involved and all collaborating towards the same goal. I also wanted to mention that with the African-led concept, having manufacturing and R&D and everything. So yes, these immunogens are coming from outside of Africa, but with technology transfer and with collaboration again and capacity building, hopefully this can be, further immunogens can be developed, manufactured, and all the R&D process can happen in-house. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Shital. And I just want to go back to your point on leveraging African talents. I think that's a powerful point where we need to ensure that even as we are advocating for this, for R&D within the continent, we leverage the African continent. And I'd like to hand over to Maureen to take over the next question.
Thank you so much, Catriona. Just a reminder to our participants to please submit your questions in the Q&A. I've seen, I think, a few comments and questions, so we'll get to that. But the next question is for you, Nike. You spoke passionately about Achieve. I think the recent launch of Achieve in Africa, I think to some extent signals a renewed political momentum around vaccine R&D and also manufacturing self-reliance. Could you just elaborate on IAVI's role in shaping this initiative and what key factors enabled its mobilization?
No, thanks. The first thing, thanks again, the parliamentarian. A very good point. Getting the policymakers really in this conversation, again, kudos. That's very important, because usually they quite get the product when it's ready, packaged, and submitted to them, and sometimes they don't get the whole sense of the conversation. But now having them part of the debate, I think this is excellent. So I mean, look, he mentioned Abuja Declaration. I can list a long list of declarations. The most recent Lusaka Agenda, the Accra Reset. So it means that we're going to get all these capital cities listed somewhere. We really want to move out of this. I think the political rhetorics really being pragmatic. Our people are dying of HIV/AIDS. What do? We don't need this declaration. We need actions now. I think what we've learned is that, and that's again the title of the topic today, from really, I mean, we submitted a proposal. a concept note actually, to USAID. That's December 2024. And then January, you know what happened? A new government that get just USAID dismantled, and then there's nowhere to be found. How do we think of how do we move from there? I think this is where the question comes in on really ensuring that this prioritization of diseases that are required for us to move this agenda or local manufacture is important. But again, all the highest level of political or decisions or policies have already been published. If you go to the AU, there's that the Executive Council, the highest body in decision making, has already acknowledged the fact we need to manufacture. Then now, where do we get the funding? That's where the most important question comes in. And I'm very happy the parliamentarian mentioned it's 1979 that the Executive Council of the AU made the decision on domestic resource mobilization. But the point here, Maureen, is that having worked with the African Union, I think the researchers are not making a good case, or we are not making a good case for ourselves. Because this is where you leverage. You go from decisions, the political will. If we push on them, they're going to come with all list of declaration. But how are we, researchers, looking for funding to get the science done? Are we really go through those policy decisions, political decisions, and so on, executive council decisions, and see how we can get them implemented? I think there's a disconnect. There's a breach there between the science and then the politics. We need something, and then that's where I'm so happy to see the parliamentarians go on their ways to really getting or reaching out to us to be sure that they can support us. I think this is important. So I think the other point is the regulatory. I think that mentioned. I think it was mentioned earlier. I think it's critical as well. This is a continent. 55, if we go for 55 national regulatory authorities, we're not going to get anywhere. There will be fragmentation of the regulatory system. So one of the things we're trying to do as IAVI is to be sure we support at our own level. One single institution cannot do it all. So we're trying to support each of those pieces of the ecosystem to be sure that we get the regulatory harmonization, supporting the regulators to achieve maturity level 3. It's important because one of the questions that will come next, vaccine made in Africa, the question standard, quality. I think you want to build trust. And then I also like the previous speaker mentioning that she's quite right. We really want to see that it's Africa-led. Our community want to see Africa-led. And I usually take a good example of the Sisonke trial in South Africa during COVID. The AU banked, put in billions to procure the J&J vaccine. And then at that particular time, there was a decision from wherever that is not vaccine, whatever decision, but we had to go back and say, but we have African, the largest clinical trial, and the individuals on this trial, what is the data, really, what is coming out of the data? That's what saved that vaccine. We secured $2 billion to procure only that vaccine, single dose. You don't have to get a second series to get to because of the loss of follow-up or all our knowledge based on clinical trials. If you get vaccinated, go. I mean, we are just happy that you got it, and then you're going to really break the chain of transmission. But someone comes and said, "Oh, that's a..." So we really want to be sure data coming out of the continent can inform also decision on this continent, that African are actually part of the decision-making processes. So to conclude there, really, there's a lot to do, but I'll conclude with the example of South Korea. South Korea 20 years ago was only manufacturing 5% of their vaccine. Today, they are about 65, close to 70%. Why? 3 things: financing, blended financing mechanism. Second, funding R&D. And the third one, human capital development. Good science can inform regulatory. Agreed. If you get regulatory, in fact, we can't do R&D without involving the regulators. So they go hand in hand. R&D, financing, human capital. We need to start training a pool of African scientists that can support R&D and the industry to manufacture at scale. And then the HIV vaccine is going to follow. So thanks so much, and back to you, Maureen.
Thank you so much. Indeed, we need to move beyond declarations. We need to move beyond political rhetoric. So I will now hand over to Catriona to take us to the next.
Thank you so much, Maureen. And I just want to urge the participants to add your questions to the Q&A section of the webinar. My next question goes to Michelle Mulder and from SAMRC. And I just wanted to ask, how can national research councils and institutions like SAMRC serve as hubs to coordinate multi-stakeholder collaborations, share expertise, and sustain long-term HIV vaccine research?
Thanks, Catriona, and very a happy day for everybody. I wanted to say a big thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this, and good afternoon to all. So if you don't mind, I'm going to answer this question very much focusing on the SAMRC, obviously as a national council. And I think we do serve as an example of how national councils can coordinate these large consortia and these important national, regional, and global or continental programs. So the SAMRC is a national science council, and why I use this example is because we have a model that's very similar to our sister organizations on the continent, and therefore is very much replicable across the continent. So we're a national science council. We report to the National Department of Health. And we have a number of different functions. So we conduct research, we fund research, we support innovation and research capacity development. And we really see ourselves as the custodian or the main driver or engine of the national health research enterprise in South Africa specifically. We have a national footprint. We are also relatively neutral. We do conduct research in-house, but we are relatively neutral in terms of our funding role. But we are also very well networked both locally and globally. We use public funds, so government funds from South Africa and government funds from elsewhere, including Europe and elsewhere, but also philanthropic and contract funds to invest in this national health research enterprise. And all of those really make us, as a national council, an ideal vehicle to coordinate multi-stakeholder collaborations, to bring in and manage funding, and particularly to drive a shared national and continental research agenda. We've also got decades and a very strong history of driving and coordinating these kinds of programs. Very relevant, obviously, for this audience is the South African AIDS Vaccine Initiative, which we drove for 10 years from 1999. That was followed by our Strategic Health Innovation Partnerships program, which is still ongoing, but for about 10 to 15 years, had quite a focused HIV vaccine development program. You heard about the Brilliant program, which we coordinated. We're involved in the mRNA Hub, which includes HIV vaccine development and so on. So we do have a very strong history and track record of managing and coordinating these big programs. I mentioned that we're very well networked. So we've got a very deep understanding of, particularly in South Africa, the network of researchers, expertise, infrastructure that's available. So we are able to put the right people together, get the right people around the table. But also we use open competitive processes. So what that does is it casts the net a lot wider. We make sure that we get as many researchers involved as possible who have something to contribute to the research agenda. So getting all of these processes, these partners on board is what we do as a science council. But I think the most important thing is that as a national council, we bring in government funding commitment. And what that does is to show national commitment, political will, and to bring in additional funding from elsewhere. And I think this is really critical if we are going to lead science from Africa, is we have to put our money on the table, and that is really what gets us a seat at the table. And I think Daniel mentioned it, Nikeza mentioned it earlier, having that seat at the table, which enables us to co-drive these initiatives and to set the agenda, which I think is critical. Just the last thing I want to mention is, as a national council, we can also dedicate resources to the program and project management. So coordinating these big national programs, HIV vaccine programs, or even regional and continental ones, does not just happen. It really requires dedicated resources. You need the program managers, the project managers who are bringing in the funding, who are managing the funding, who are coordinating all the moving parts. And I think that really is critical and something that is particularly unique, I think, and a unique role that can be played by national councils. So I think I've mentioned, some of the examples we've been involved in, but I want to encourage our sister organizations that this is really a unique role that can be taken up by national councils throughout Africa to coordinate such initiatives. Thanks, Catriona.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. And yeah, if your model can be copied and pasted all over Africa, I believe we'll have R&D being funded locally within the continent fully. I just want to hand over to Michelle for the next, and I believe that maybe the last question. Over to you, Maureen.
Thanks, Catriona. So the next question is for you, Amelia. From your experience leading community engagement at the growth site, what mechanism work best or have worked best to ensure that community engagement structures and the regional organizations are not just consulted, but they are actively shaping the HIV vaccine research partnerships? Or in other words, what mechanism have worked best to ensure that there's indeed meaningful community engagement? Over to you.
All right. Good morning and good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Amelia Mfiki, the Community Liaison Officer at Grotesque Clinical Trials. Thank you for the opportunity. Once again, and I think one of the things that have assisted us in the community engagement space is to make sure that we understand what is expected of communities within communities in research and outside research. By that I mean we need to make sure that for us to be in line with our work in research, we also need to understand what are the communities that we work with. By that, we make sure that we do the community mapping, identifying the organizations and stakeholders in the catchment area and presenting the work that we're doing. It's beneficial if you do it individually to those organizations. So when you start to develop and establish your community advisory board, at least you have had a meet and greet with your organizations that they will form part of the CAP. But before they get to a CAP, you also need to make sure that you organize the community engagement where you are presenting the expectation and the idea from the site as to how do we then communicate between our site and also within the communities. And it makes it easy for you to identify what are the strategic organization to work with. And also it makes it easy for you to understand where are the gatekeepers and how do you then approach and engage with them. One of the key things that we need to master in the community program is to make sure that you have existing and functional CAP. By that I mean you need to make sure that the organizations that you identify or the individuals that you identify to be part of your CAP are visible in their communities and they are vocal about who they are and what they think community want. Because we need to make sure that we engage with communities and we get the mandate from the communities as to what is it that is expected and what are the concerns from communities to the research side. So you need to make sure that the individuals that are part of a CAP are also the people that will advise you on the best practices, including in the consenting form, because when you do the protocol, when you present the protocol, and the consent to the CAB, they need to tell you, no, this is not on, and this is how we want it for the communities that we are working in. And also, given the specific population that you work with, you need to make sure that in your community advisory board, you have those voices so that you don't talk on their behalf, but you engage with them. And I think we are guided by the good participatory practice. The GPP principles are telling us about respect. They are telling us about the community stakeholders autonomous. And in that, it tells us that what steps to follow when we engage and when we approach communities for the best practices. One of the things that we need to look at is to make sure that we include communities. And also, inclusion is not just inviting them to sit in your table and discuss your issues, but also for you as a site to believe that communities belong in your site. And that is not only interpreted by you inviting them in a meeting, but also we see that when you plan and cost your community budget and include the community activities in your costing as the site. And also, I'm calling on the sponsors in this room, in this webinar, to make sure that when the study are coming in, at least let's cost the community program. All the CLOs, I believe that they have a mandate to develop the community implementable plan, and that plan include recruitment, retention, community engagement, and dissemination. And we need to make sure that we cost those activities, including other networking strategies that countries and other sites may use to make sure that we are visible, because communities are expected to be at the center of the work that we are doing. Just the last one, in terms of how you then keep your communities engaged, because this one is crucial. We keep our communities engaged by making sure that we develop a plan that communicate regularly with those communities. And also, you communicate also the information that you believe that is not as useful as it is for communities. But by doing that, you are building that trust within your community space to say, this is what is happening in our site right now, and these are the studies that have worked, and these are the findings and the results of the study, including those studies that may be stopped because of whatever reasons that are presented to us by the sponsors and the PIs. You need to make sure that you are transparent to your site and you are transparent to your communities as much as you can. You also need to be specific, because sometimes you present general and you are vague, and communities do not understand that, particularly in the HIV vaccine, because Brilliant is one of the exciting concepts that we are looking at, the hope for HIV vaccine. And it's exciting because some communities do not understand this. And we always make an example to say, in South Africa particularly, our kids go for the BCG vaccine at newborn. And we then take it to the COVID vaccine to say, this is what happened in COVID. And this is why now we are doing the HIV vaccine. And this is why we believe communities should participate. And if you engage with your communities regularly and you are visible in their activities, then it makes it easy for the programs that you are doing. All I'm calling for is to ask for the PIs and sponsors to make sure that when you develop any protocol for a study, let's cost that. Let's cost it. And also, when we develop the protocol, let's also have alignment with the commitment post-trial, so that we are not stuck after the study have finished. We are, at least we have a roadmap as to say what will happen post-trial, because that's one of the questions that communities are asking us. You guys are not disseminating the information, and also what will happen after the study. So this is why we are asking for the communities to be acknowledged and be seen as equal partners. But that is also interpreted through the programs that are happening in the specific site. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amelia, for that. And for that plea and call to action, I think especially to our researchers, those that are leading the development of all these research protocols. I think we cannot overemphasize the importance of community engagement. And thanks a lot for sharing, some of those practical strategies that we can all, apply in our various settings to ensure that community engagement is effective. But also, I think for reminding us that the community engagement does not, happen in a vacuum, right? There are some guiding principles. I think you mentioned of the GPP, and I know there are so many guiding frameworks around how we can make our community engagement effective. But also, I think it's what you mentioned, something which is very important, that community engagement is not a once-off endeavor, right? It's continuous, right? It's ongoing. So we need to make sure that it's carefully planned, it's costed, as you mentioned. So thanks a lot for sharing that. I think we can now turn to the questions in the Q&A. I'm happy to start off, I think, with the first question. I think Catriona will come in to take the other questions. So this one was addressed to Sheta. It says, what role our community is playing in shaping the trial design and participant engagement? Now when Brilliant succeeds, right, what would a true African vaccine sovereignty look like in 10 years? Shetad, would you like to take that?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, you can continue. We can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry, my video is taking a while to start, but let me start answering the question. So in terms of the role of communities that play, what role communities play in shaping the design and participant engagement. So from the start of the Brain Consortium, there was a whole community arm that informed the design of these trials, and so communities play a huge role in design and also in participant engagement. I think Amelia touched on it very well with our community advisory boards and the strategies we use to engage communities. I love the second part of the question: what can a true African vaccine sovereignty look like in 10 years? So for me, there's about 6 points that I wanted to, maybe 4 points. Let me narrow it down to 4 points in the interest of time. So first, end-to-end vaccine R&D. So designing, developing, clinically testing, regulating, and deploying an HIV vaccine. It allows us to innovate for our own epidemiologic challenges, and it allows us to actually own what's happening in our continent. Secondly, scaled manufacturing of the vaccine. Thirdly, a regulatory ecosystem that's capable of approving African developed vaccines, and systems that are capable of adaptively evaluating phase 1 and first-in-human trials, and platforms in the continent. And then lastly, very, very important, and I think Daniel touched on this as well, is sustainable financing architecture that will stabilize us against geopolitical threats. So for me, that's what we are wanting to look like in 10 years.
Thank you so much, Sheta. I hope that answers your question, Festus. Over to you, Catriona.
Thank you, Maureen. The next question I'm seeing here goes to Daniel. And the question is, what accountability mechanisms can really compel our governments to move from political commitment to enforceable physical policy? And then in the wake of shrinking of US support and the shifting of its global priorities, how can our parliaments across Africa focus funding specifically for vaccine R&D, which competes with the immediate service delivery need? Is it possible for advocates to play a role in strengthening our parliament's leverage during our national budget hearing? Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Catriona. Let me use Zimbabwe as an example. We've got various options that other stakeholders, including advocates and civil society, can take advantage to work together and partner with parliamentarians to increase pressure on the national governments in terms of domestic financing. The first and obvious one, like here in Zimbabwe, we have the petition option. If you do a petition, especially to the Parliament of Zimbabwe through the Portfolio Committee for Health on any specific issue, even in this particular instance related to research vaccine, if that petition is accepted by the Speaker, it allows for public discourse and public pressure and debate. We can conduct public hearings and oral evidence hearings, and we can actually invite you to come to Parliament and unpick further what you are petitioning about. That raises profile of the matter in debate and puts pressure not just on the Minister of Health, but also on the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Finance. We also have every Wednesday afternoon, we have what we call written questions. So working with parliamentarians whom we have trained as champions, especially as advocates, you can actually help them to come up with written questions that are more specific and force the Minister of Health to respond, and the leader of government business or the Minister of Finance, if the question is related to budget. We also have policy questions. You can also frame questions for the parliamentarians to ask on Wednesday afternoons in terms of policy-related questions. That also puts the spotlight and pressure on the government. You can also organize field visits where you invite parliamentarians to go to a specific situation where there is a model that is working positively or where there is a crisis situation. So when the parliamentarians visit that site or research center, they create spotlight and bring national focus on that. So it's something that can happen. You can also do benchmarking visits for parliamentarians to go to other countries and see models that are working and then produce report and create debate in the National Assembly to allow for national focus on the matter. So those are some of the options that are there. Also to train parliamentary champions to engage the media, whether it's the radio or television, whether it's the newspapers, whether it's the social media platform like Twitter, X, Facebook, Instagram. Parliamentarians can highlight an issue because they've got huge following and they've got public attention. So if they are trained as champions to promote vaccine research, for example, they are able to bring attention to the matter. Most importantly, most parliamentarians end up being deputy ministers and being ministers, and some end up being presidents. Some end up being speakers of parliament. So it's important to train them so that once they are set up as champions, when an opportunity comes for them to be in cabinet, in government, you now know that we've got a trained champion who is influential enough to push our agenda because they understand it clearly. They are also influential at political party level. Most parliamentarians are in leadership position within their political party, and they have access to the top leadership of government, to the other cabinet ministers or to the president or prime minister, because most parliamentarians are in leadership position at national and provincial level. So they have got enough leverage to speak into a theme or issue and influence even the political party manifestos and political party policy documents. So there are many ways which you can engage parliamentarians and work with them and make sure that we increase accountability. We also have organizations that offer training, which is something that should be done on what we call budget tracking and monitoring, so that parliamentarians have got a matrix system where they're able, or a dashboard system where they're able to say that how much did the government commit. So before the budget is announced, parliamentarians are able to say, how much did you commit last year or in the recent years? What have been the trends? And to push for that budget declaration percentage of 15%. And then once the budget is announced, for parliamentarians to be capacity build, also to track how much money is actually dispersed towards research or towards health. And then also in terms of their role as an oversight watchdog, to have systems of tracking in terms of the actual expenditure and the use of the money allocated towards health, and where there is need for them to flag and play their watchdog role, then they'll be able to do that. So there are many ways for parliamentarians to work with other stakeholders, special advocates. I also wanted to mention that researchers are very important, because any latest data, any latest information, parliamentarians, if they get hold of it, they will use it. There is what we call a point of national interest. A parliamentarian can use a research report and raise issues or recommendations in that research report using what we call a point of national interest. Thank you so much. Those are some of the options that are available.
Thank you, Daniel, for that. For the example from Zimbabwe on how every Wednesdays you have written questions. Yeah, that's one thing that can be picked from for different governments across Africa. And I'd like to hand over to Maureen. Maureen, would you like to take the next question before we move on to...
Yeah. Thanks, Kationa. I'm also looking at the time. So maybe we can take the last question from the Q&A. This is from Tolly. And this one, I think anyone can respond to this question. So Tori asked, could the speakers maybe tell us a bit about how success is being defined and measured in this transformed working landscape, especially around capacity strengthening and equitable engagement in the international consortia. And maybe perhaps an extension to that, I think I did mention at the very beginning that we know lenacapavir is being rolled out across multiple countries in places where a lot of HIV vaccine R&D is actually happening. Does anything need to change? Does it, for example, maybe the target product profile need to change, or does it trial? Is there anything around maybe trial design issues that needs to change in the work of lenacapavir? As much as we know that it's not a vaccine and it's far from perfect, but is there anything that we need to be looking at different in the work of lenacapavir? So yeah, so a Tori's question and perhaps an extension to that, but anyone can respond to that. I don't know who is ready to respond to that. I don't want to pick on anyone. I can start with you, Shata. Do you want to maybe say a few words and maybe others can come in? Or maybe Michelle.
Thanks. It's not a very easy question, but I'll try and tackle the one about how success is being defined and measured. Obviously, when Brilliant was very active as the initial program funded by USAID, we had a very extensive MEL plan, monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan, looking at participation of the different consortium members in developing the protocols, but mostly sort of milestone based. What are we trying to achieve here, and in what timeline, and obviously then measuring to what extent we are achieving those goals. But then I think the capacity development component was also very important. So how many of your mid-level researchers versus your early career researchers are being pulled along? So being included, for example, as co-PIs in the design of the studies and the execution of the studies. How many students are being included, and so on. So I think you've got your very definite measures, which are what are the activities you plan to undertake, and obviously have you achieved them or not. But then there is the broader transformation type and capacity development components, which I think can be slightly more difficult to measure. And I think the main thing is not just the measures themselves, but the learning agenda. And as you go along, the important part of the Brilliant program was to take stock at different parts along the journey to say, what have we learned? How do we course correct? Do we have to change anything? How do we improve what we're doing, and so on? So I think that keeping a learning agenda in mind together with sort of concrete measurements, I think is quite important for growing and strengthening these programs. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I hope to some extent.
Yeah, I think it does. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that. Thanks, Michelle, for bringing this. Yeah, over to you.
Sorry for my technical challenges today. I really apologize. But okay. I thought I'd touch on your lenacapavir question, if you could repeat it, and then I could touch on.
Yeah. So for lenacapavir, I think the question was. So in the work, as we know that lenacapavir is being rolled out across, I think, a number of countries where HIV vaccine R&D is also happening. So the question is there anything that needs to change as we are designing our HIV vaccine R&D? Are there any trial design issues that we need to change in the work of lenacapavir? Or is there anything we need to change maybe around target product profile? Yeah, that was the question around lenacapavir.
Yeah, so with the emerging PrEP landscape and with lenacapavir obviously promising to be this game changer and changing the face of HIV prevention, I think the important thing in terms of trial design and in terms of what we need to consider of how we measure the the outcomes of these clinical trials and what we're looking at. So very importantly, correlates of protection and in the trials are important. So looking at more the lab-based work and how that could translate into protection with the background of PrEP. Because of course, in an HIV vaccine trial, yes, these are all phase 1 trials, and we're looking at safety and immunogenicity, which we'll get great answers about immunogenicity. But moving on to phase 2 and phase 3 trials, moving on to phase 2 and phase 3 trials, it's not going to be ethical to conduct these studies without offering PrEP, and obviously lenacapavir hopefully being available in most countries by then without offering the standard of care or the best standard of PrEP.
Thank you so much for that. I'll hand over to Catriona. I think we should be wrapping up now. I'm just looking at the time. Over to you, Catriona.
Thank you so much, Maureen, for that. And I want to thank my co-moderator, Maureen, as well as all the participants for your questions and meaningful participation. We are very grateful. And I just want to thank everyone for attending on behalf of IAS, the International AIDS Society, and IAVI. Thank you so much. So today, as we discussed and learned about turning challenges into opportunities, partnerships, where we looked at partnership models for sustained HIV vaccine research in Africa, we had a lot from our panelists, and I'd like to touch on what Daniel mentioned about how we've a lot focused our advocacy on the global north. And right now it's an opportunity for us to promote domestic resource mobilization for health R&D. And apart from that, Shital also talked about leveraging Africa talents, which is very critical to ensure that we are growing our own talent in this space. And Nikkei touched on the fact that domestic resource mobilization has been talked about since 1979. Are we still going to talk about it, or are we going to implement it? He also emphasized that our people are dying. What are we going to do about it to ensure that that we make change within that space? And then Michelle also highlighted an example of how national councils can coordinate consortiums. And I liked her example. And if it can be copy-pasted all over Africa, we are going to make great strides. Not forgetting about our last speaker, Amelia Mfiki, who talked of the importance of funding community engagement. And it's not just a one-off, it should be a continuous model where the community engaged to participate. So thank you so much for your participation. A recording of the session will be made publicly available shortly on the IAS website. So stay tuned for the next sessions of this advocacy series on New Horizons for HIV vaccine R&D, an advocacy engagement series. We have many more exciting discussions on HIV vaccine advocacy and research coming up. We look forward to having you join us. Thank you and bye-bye.